The Senate failed to advance the joint border and foreign aid bill during a procedural vote today. It fell 11 votes short of the needed 60 votes. Now Majority Leader Chuck Schumer plans to hold a vote on just the $95 billion in aid, legislation without any border provisions. It's unclear if that has the necessary support to pass. Scott MacFarlane and Weijia Jiang join us now. Scott is a CBS News congressional correspondent, and Weijia is CBS News' senior White House correspondent. Great to have you both with us. Scott, let's begin with you. This was a procedural vote on the Senate border bill, and it has now failed. So what is the state of play on all of these negotiations and discussions?
This was a test vote of sorts to kind of measure support for where people were on this $118 billion border security, Ukraine and Israel aid package. The test failed, and everybody knew it was going to fail. But the vote total is telling, I think, in a bigger way. And as the evening began here at the Capitol, a bigger picture is emerging. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, wasn't just supporting this bill or championing it over the past 2 weeks. He was triumphantly championing it. He was trying to give it oxygen and rally the troops. The troops did not follow the leader. Just 4 Republicans voted in favor of this bill that Mitch McConnell was the leader on. What does that mean, Bob, for the next big thing to come down the pike? What does that mean if there's a leader in the U.S. Senate who doesn't have his followers in line? This may bode not so well for when the government funding deadlines approach in early March. This may not bode terribly well when it's time for push to come to shove on Ukraine aid, which Mitch McConnell's also been championing, but from which he's had defections among his fellow Republicans. That's the bigger picture as the night begins after a not terribly surprising failure of the border deal today.
Scott, excellent reporting there. And usually in Washington, a lot of these grumbles about Senate Republican leadership happen behind closed doors. But Senator Ted Cruz said it publicly today. Let's listen.
Everyone here also supported a leadership challenge to Mitch McConnell in November. I think a Republican leader should actually lead this conference and should advance the priorities of Republicans.
That was actually Senator Cruz from yesterday, but the point still stands. There are frustrations inside of the Senate GOP. Scott, with the House GOP now failing to pass its Mayorkas impeachment of the DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, what does that mean for Israel funding, for Ukraine funding, and for impeachment moving forward, should the Speaker want to do it again?
You see the same thing happening in both chambers. You have a breakaway faction of Republicans who seem to be overriding, to a degree having some veto power over their own leadership. It manifested itself in the U.S. Senate with that border deal collapsing. It manifested itself in the U.S. House with all of the standoffs and all the failed votes over the past few months. None quite as notorious or high profile as the one last night. 1 vote short, Republicans were, in impeaching Alejandro Mayorkas. They think their odds will be better when Steve Scalise returns from his medical leave in the coming days. They'll probably put this back on the calendar next week. But it shows a bit of dysfunction and a lack of continuity between the leadership of the House and its rank and file members that is going to surface again when those government deadlines or government funding deadlines hit and Israel and Ukraine come back before the U.S. House. There doesn't seem to be, Bob, a critical mass of Republicans in the House ready to back Ukraine aid in any context, in any way. That's also leaking support among Senate Republicans. That's the emerging story here. There's an emergent need for aid to Ukraine. The administration says it, its supporters say that. And I don't see a pathway through right now of getting bipartisan support, a real efficient bipartisan support to pass it.
Weijia, when Democrats at the White House and President Biden look at what's happening among House Republicans, among Senate Republicans, what are they saying behind the scenes and to cameras and to reporters like yourself? Are they just going to watch the spectacle for now and hope it all settles eventually, or are they taking some steps to restart the negotiations?
Well, Robert, even before today's procedural vote, President Biden seemed to know what was going to happen. He said that all indications are that this bill won't even move forward on the Senate floor. And his frustration is not directed at Leader Mitch McConnell. It was squarely directed at who appears to be someone who never ceased to be the unofficial leader of the Republican Party, if you ask some, including President Biden, perhaps, because he says this is all the fault of former President Donald Trump. And if you look at the timeline, Robert, of when Trump really started blasting this deal in public, criticizing it and calling on Republicans not to pass it, it does track, because there was a lot of optimism coming from the Senate and coming from White House officials, both in front and behind the scenes, that the Senate would be able to get this through. But once Trump injected himself into it, it all started to crumble. And this is what President Biden had to say about that yesterday.
We're going to secure the border and fund these other programs. Trump and the MAGA Republicans said no, because they're afraid of Donald Trump. Afraid of Donald Trump. Every day between now and November, the American people are going to know that the only reason the border is not secure is Donald Trump and his MAGA Republican friends.
So the strategy now for the president is to continue to hammer home that message that he believes that this is all Donald Trump's fault, that there is no bipartisan border agreement. However, the president still has to figure out what he's going to do about all that other aid that you guys just talked about, because this bill was so essential for funding for Ukraine, for funding for Israel, for funding for the Indo-Pacific. And yesterday, when asked if he'd be willing to support any of those measures separately from the border, or perhaps bundle one or two issues together, somehow figure out a formula to move forward, the president said he wasn't ready to concede that yet, because he was hanging on to some sliver of hope that this would still move forward in its current form. But as we know now, that isn't going to happen.
And Weijia, what happens now on immigration and border policy if the White House has no helping hand in terms of congressional assistance, if they're fighting amongst themselves on Capitol Hill? Does it all become executive action for the rest of the year? How does the White House see this issue?
Well, the White House does not believe the president has much more executive action that he can take, which has been their ongoing issue with this. And they've called out Congress for quite some time now, since the very first day he took office, saying that he can only do so much, and it's really up to lawmakers, which is why they expressed that optimism that perhaps for the first time in decades they would be able to come to some sort of bipartisan agreement. But we should remember that even if this was ever going to pass in the Senate, House Republicans, Speaker Johnson made pretty clear that it was going to be pretty near impossible for it to go through the House if it didn't include all of their priorities. So even before Trump started getting involved in the conversation, House Republicans told the administration as much, that it would be very difficult. And so that is why the president is so upset right now, because he felt like they were getting closer, that they were making some sort of movement, and he felt that he could find an agreement with House Republicans somewhere, and that just didn't happen. But to answer your question, Bob, there's not much more that he can do with regard to executive action.
I remember a decade ago, then Vice President Biden used to go to the Hill all the time to work with Senator McConnell on those fiscal deals when things were hitting a snag. A different Washington now. A lot of chaos, a lot of anger and frustration on both sides. Scott MacFarlane and Weijia Jiang, thank you. Appreciate it.